Hey everybody, this is Jimmy again with another lesson. We're going to give a lesson today about Carberator Ice. But before I do, I heard a great joke I'd like to share with you. There's this flight school, and a blonde walks into the flight school, and she would like to get some helicopter lessons. She wants to do helicopters because, of course, everybody knows helicopters are awesome. And she goes to a CFI, and CFI says, "What can I do for you?" She's like, "Well, I'd like to learn how to fly a helicopter." He says, "Great, well, let's sit down and talk about the helicopters." She says, "Okay." They sit down and have a ground lesson, and she does great. She remembers everything. Everything she needs to know, she remembers. And the CFI says, "This is wonderful. Why don't we go out and take a look at a helicopter, maybe go for a flight?" She said, "I'd love to go for a flight." Excuse me. They go out to the helicopter. They do a pre-flight. And he says, "You did a great job with the pre-flight. Let's see how well we can do on a little flight." She says, "Awesome, let's do it." They get in the helicopter and they start to hover, and they're hovering for a few minutes, and this flight instructor says, "Wow, you're doing such a great job hovering. Let's go ahead and transition into forward flight." They transition into forward flight, and she's just picking it up like nobody's business. She's getting it. She's doing great. Coordinated turns, everything. And the instructor says, "Wow, this is great. Well, let's take it up and let's do some auto rotations." She says, "Okay, let's do it." And they go and they do a few auto rotations, and she picks it up, bam, just like that. And he says, "Wow, this is amazing. You fly like you've done this before." And he says, "I'll tell you what, I'm going to let you fly solo." And she says, "Okay." He says, "Put me on the ground." He gets out of the helicopter, and up she goes. And on the radio he says, "Wow, you're doing awesome. Why don't you fly up to 50 feet? And she takes the helicopter up to 50 feet, no problem. And he says, "This is wonderful. Go up to 500 feet. And she goes up to 500 feet. And he says, "Wow, you're doing great. This is wonderful. Why don't you take it up to 5,000 feet? She goes up to 5,000 feet, and a few minutes later, all of a sudden, he hears the engine die, and the helicopter comes crashing down to the ground. And she gets out of the helicopter, and the flight instructor says, "Well, what happened?" And she says, "Well, it got a little cold up there, so I turned off the fan." Boom. Okay, but we're really going to talk about the carburetors and carburetors ice that are in helicopters or in most general aviation aircraft. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about what a carburetor actually is. So what a carburetor does, and I actually have a good example right here. A carburetor mixes incoming air with fuel and delivers it to the combustion chamber. As air passes through this venturi right here, the air increases with velocity but decreases in pressure. Fuel enters from this float chamber, where it is maintained at a nearly constant level by this float device in here. And in this particular example, it's a ball-shaped device. And the discharge nozzle is located somewhere within this venturi where the pressure is a little lower, and that's caused by the venturi. Fuel is then forced through the discharge nozzle by the higher atmospheric pressure of this float chamber. Now, carburetor ice happens because of the effect of fuel vaporization and the decrease in pressure in the venturi, which causes a sharp temperature drop in the carburetor. Carburetor ice is very dangerous. I'm going to put up our next little presentation here. And a lot of people have had a lot of problems with carburetor ice. The main thing that people need to remember about carburetor ice is that it can just happen. And a lot of times, a lot of aircraft a lot of aircraft, it's very hard to detect because a lot of aircraft will have a governor, especially helicopters. A lot of smaller helicopters, R-22s, R-44s, they have a governor on there. And if the governor's on there, as the carb ice continues to build inside the carburetor, the governor is just going to continue to increase. So it's going to make it hard for us to know what's happening. But we'll get to that in just a minute. So as I mentioned, the carb ice happens because as the fuel vaporizes, because of the decreased pressure right here in the venturi, it causes a sharp temperature drop within the carburetor. If there's any water vapor or any type of moisture in the air when the carburetor temperature is so low, ice can form in certain areas on the inside of the carburetor, including the throttle valve. So if we look closely here, as you remember from the last one, this is our float chamber. And this is our venturi. this is our venturi, and as the fuel is forced up into the venturi, our air intake right here, this is where our air comes in, at cooler temperatures and with moisture in the air, ice can actually form on the inside of this venturi right here, and actually on the throttle valve itself. Now, this is likely to happen below 21 degrees Celsius, about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and usually about 80% humidity. Now, it is important to note that if there's any type of moisture in the air at all, carb ice can actually happen at any time. So we do need to be extremely, extremely careful as we continue to fly our helicopters, or any aircraft that has a float type carburetor. It's not as common in a fuel injected, although it can happen, so we still do need to be careful. Carberator ice. Why can carburator ice be dangerous? Well, there's a few reasons. One is that it can actually cut the engine out if we're not aware of what's happening, putting us into an emergency situation and having to land without power, which nobody wants. That's just not a good position to be in. Two, it can use more power than is available, again putting us in another just dangerous position to have to land. So it's very important that we can realize and kind of understand when onset of coming is. One way that we can actually help keep an eye on our carburetor and the heat or the ice is to check out our carb heat gauge. And in that carb heat, in your aircraft, a lot of them will have a carb heat gauge. The carb heat gauge will tell us how hot or cool it is getting inside the carburetor. Some indications of carb heat would be a drop in our engine RPM, a little bit of engine roughness, and of course, fuel starvation is kind of what we're looking for. But how do we get rid of the carburetor ice, or even prevent it from happening in the first place? Well, that's our carb heat. And a lot of times, and especially in our little helicopters, the carb heat is just a little device that you just pull, and it turns the carb heat on. It adds some carb heat to it. Carb heat is also especially dangerous at low power settings, and unfortunately, it may go unnoticed until we're adding power, and the power's not there when we need it. But how does our carb heat actually work? Well, the carb heat actually routes air across the heat source before it enters the carburetor. And when it enters the carburetor, it'll actually melt this down so that it goes right into the engine now, or it goes right out, and it doesn't hardly have any effect if it's taken care of properly. Carb heat affects engine slightly. It'll cause a slight decrease in engine power. The heat is less dense, and if ice is present in there when we use the carb heat, there'll be a decrease followed by a gradual increase of our RPMs. So we'll need to make sure that we're on our pedals and we're doing well, because when we add, you can definitely feel the difference when you have to add carb heat or you actually take some away because you don't need it. But again, we do need to be especially careful of carb heat. People have died because they haven't recognized the onset of it. They haven't been managing or maintaining their carb heat system, and unfortunately, people have just dropped out of the sky, and we don't want that to happen to anybody else. So, as always, if you guys have any questions or comments, please leave a note down here, and I'll be happy to answer anything you might have. And I hope you guys enjoyed the lesson and enjoyed the joke. Have a great day.